His highly anticipated meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Wednesday. Biden says he doesn't expect big outcomes from these talks, but plans to confront Putin about cyber attacks and election interference. Putin, meanwhile, says relations with the US are at their lowest point in years, but stresses he's open to dialogue.
We have a bilateral relationship that has deteriorated to what is the lowest point in recent years. However, there are still matters that need comparing and identifying, and a determination of mutual positions, so that issues of mutual interest can be solved more effectively to the benefit of both the United States and Russia.
Well, Bernard Smith has more now from Moscow on just what Putin might hope to get out of this summit.
It's been 7 years since the G8 became the G7 and Russia stopped getting invites. Vladimir Putin's decision to annex Crimea prompted the suspension from this gathering of the world's most powerful democracies. Since then, Russia's president has become more isolated. Only the president of Tajikistan joined him for the Victory Day commemorations, so a summit with the US president is a coup for Putin.
The meeting will be widely promoted by Russian propaganda because Putin is sort of emerging from international isolation and at the highest level. For him, the fact of the summit itself is important, but it's the US that's driving the agenda.
It's far from clear what Putin will get from his talks with Biden.
I'm heading to meet with Mr. Putin to let him know what I want him to know.
The US government's Russia policy presumes a high degree of friction in the relationship.
If
Putin gets nothing from this meeting, I think he'll show us a scary movie and it'll be bad. If the almost war in April wasn't enough, in September we'll get a semi-war. Would it be difficult for Moscow to send its troops into Ukraine? No.
As well as Ukraine, there'll be plenty to talk about when both men meet in this villa on the shores of Lake Geneva. Disputes over election interference, cybercrime and human rights cast a shadow over the meeting. Arms control and regional conflicts will also be on the agenda.
I think Biden's strategy is based on the fact that American society, economy and technologies have a future, while Putin's regime has no future. That's why Biden doesn't need to rush. Americans are not really worried about the fate of Navalny or other jailed Russian opposition members. So there will be pressure on Putin, but not very strong, because they need to keep the communication channel open.
Is it even possible for the US and Russia to come to agreement over the status of Crimea? Or what to do about the Belarus dictator Alexander Lukashenko? Or how to resolve the Syrian civil war?
The problem is simple. The West can't give Putin what he wants. Freedom of action in the post-Soviet region. Cannot and will not. While that's exactly what Putin needs. So we're in a dead end and may well end up with a war.
At least on the restaffing of each other's embassies, both leaders could come to a mutually beneficial agreement.
Years of tit-for-tat expulsions have left US and Russian diplomatic missions operating with skeleton staff. That affects diplomatic exchanges and has severely disrupted the issuing of visas. Russia's foreign ministry says it's ready to resume normal operations with just 24 hours notice if the US agrees. Bernard Smith, Al Jazeera, Moscow.
Well, let's now speak to Marwan Bishara. He's Al Jazeera's senior political analyst. He joins us now from here in Doha. Marwan, I was looking at this language from the Americans. Not a big set of deliverables ahead of this meeting. I mean, everyone's clearly trying to play down expectations. So what is the strategy here?
Well, yeah, you're right. Everyone is trying to play down expectations. And yet there is a meeting taking place. And the fact that the meeting is taking place is in and by itself an important step forward. So we know two things. One, they're not going to come out of the meeting the best friends. And two, they're not going to come out of the meeting the worst of enemies. So the result is going to be somewhere in between. For Biden, in his words, he would want a more stable relationship, a more predictable relationship with Russia. For the Russians, they want mutual respect. They want the United States not to interfere in their internal affairs. So I think probably the best way forward that we could expect out of the meeting is at least the establishment of a systematic strategic dialogue between the two countries where all the problems that they have could be put on the table and taken on one by one and resolved one by one, because none of them could be resolved all at once in one short summit.
Of course. Well, it feels like Biden is trying to differentiate himself as well from Trump's approach. Is that why we're seeing this emphasis now on calling out Moscow when it comes to election interference, for example?
Well, we shall see, because I think a lot of the rhetoric in the media is just most of it is basically not based in fact. I mean, the last 4 years, we've seen the United States walk away from the intermediate nuclear missiles agreement with Russia. We've seen it walk away from the open sky agreement with Russia. So Trump, in fact, expanded NATO. He put more troops there, and he walked out of agreements with Moscow. So all in all, despite Trump's rhetoric, the administration, or Washington in general, wasn't exactly forgiving when it came to Putin and Russian foreign policy. Now, Biden is, of course, trying to do something else. He tries to speak softer, and yet at the same time carry a big stick. He's having more than a menacing language towards Putin, as we know, at one point calling him a killer. But at the same time, he's showing more willingness to engage. Now, what does that mean? And I just, for our viewers around the world, it's important to give a bit of context. For the past 250 years, world powers like the United States and Russia have been at times responsible, but most times utterly reckless. Some of the worst devastations that were brought on this humanity the past 250 years were brought about by superpowers. So here is the time, is the test for these two superpowers to actually decide whether they're going to go on some reckless voyage where they're going to destabilize Europe and the international system, or they're going to engage in some real dialogue, knowing all too well that heating the relations between them, and both of them being nuclear powers, serves none.
Well, speaking of superpowers, I'm sure China will be watching very closely indeed as well. Marwan Bashara there, Al Jazeera's senior political analyst, speaking to us from here in Doha. Great to get your thoughts, Marwan. Thanks for joining us again.